The Grand Cathedral of St. Matthew's in New York City had never witnessed such a wedding. Fifth Avenue's most eligible bachelor, Duke Harrison Blackwood III, heir to a railroad fortune, finally taking a bride. But as his lips touched those of Miss Evangeline Hartwell in what should have been their first kiss as husband and wife, his whispered words shattered her world. "My heart died with the mother of my daughters." The congregation gasped. The bride's bouquet of white roses fell to the marble floor. And in that moment, Evangeline realized she had married not a man, but a ghost haunted by a love she could never replace. What she didn't know was that this devastating beginning would lead her to discover a strength she never knew she possessed, in a love more powerful than any she had ever imagined. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Hartwell mansion on Fifth Avenue, casting long shadows across the Persian rugs that had been imported at great expense from the Orient. Evangeline Hartwell stood before her vanity mirror, her reflection showing a young woman of 22 with auburn hair that caught the light like burnished copper and green eyes that held an intelligence her finishing school had tried to suppress. Her lady's maid Mary carefully arranged the final pearl in her elaborate coiffure, preparing her for what society deemed the most important day of her life. "Miss Evangeline, you look like an angel descended from heaven itself," Mary whispered, her Irish accent thick with emotion. "The Duke won't know what struck him." Evangeline's fingers trembled as she touched the diamond necklace that had belonged to her grandmother, a woman who had also married for duty rather than love. The weight of it felt like chains around her throat. Through her window she could see the bustling streets of Manhattan in 1895, where horse-drawn carriages competed with the occasional motor car, and women in bustles hurried past with purpose she envied. "Mary, do you think it's possible to love someone you barely know?" Evangeline asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The older woman's hands stilled in their work. "Love grows, miss, like a garden tended with care." But Evangeline wondered if Duke Harrison Blackwood III would ever tend such a garden. Their courtship had been brief and formal, a series of chaperoned visits in her father's study, discussions of business mergers disguised as romantic interest. The Duke was undeniably handsome, with his dark hair and piercing blue eyes, but there was something distant about him, as if he were looking through her rather than at her. Her father, Cornelius Hartwell, had been clear about the advantages of this union. The Blackwood Railroad empire would merge with the Hartwell shipping fortune, creating an unstoppable force in American commerce. "Think of your future children, Evangeline," he had said. "They will want for nothing." What he hadn't mentioned was love, passion, or even basic companionship. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. Her younger sister Charlotte entered, resplendent in pale blue silk that complemented her blonde hair and blue eyes. The conventional beauty that Evangeline had always been told she lacked. Charlotte's smile was bright, but Evangeline caught something calculating in her gaze. "Sister dear, you look absolutely radiant," Charlotte said, though her tone suggested she found this surprising. "I do hope the Duke appreciates what a fortunate man he is today." "Thank you, Charlotte." Evangeline turned from the mirror, noting how her sister's eyes lingered on the diamond necklace with obvious envy. "I must confess I'm rather curious about the Duke's daughters," Charlotte continued, settling herself on the velvet settee. "Two little girls and their mother dead these 3 years. It's quite romantic, really, how devoted he remains to her memory." Evangeline felt a chill run down her spine. She had heard whispers about the Duke's first wife, Isabella, a Spanish beauty who had died in childbirth with their second daughter. Society spoke of her in hushed, reverent tones as if she had been a saint rather than a mortal woman. "I'm sure the children need a mother's care," Evangeline replied carefully. "Oh, but can one ever truly replace a great love?" Charlotte's voice carried a note of false sympathy. "I've heard the Duke still keeps her portrait in his study and speaks to it each evening. How touching." The words hit their mark, and Evangeline felt her confidence waver. She had always known this marriage was arranged, but she had harbored secret hopes that affection might grow between them. Now, faced with the specter of a perfect deceased wife, those hopes seemed foolish indeed. Mary cleared her throat diplomatically. "Perhaps we should focus on the present, Miss Charlotte. Today is Miss Evangeline's wedding day." Charlotte rose gracefully, her smile never faltering. "Of course. I simply want my dear sister to understand what she's entering into. The Duke is a complex man with a complicated past." After Charlotte left, Evangeline sank into her chair, her elaborate wedding gown suddenly feeling like a costume for a role she wasn't sure she could play. Outside, she could hear the sounds of preparation servants arranging flowers, musicians tuning their instruments, and the steady stream of carriages arriving with wedding guests. Her mother appeared in the doorway, elegant in deep purple silk, her face showing the strain of organizing such a grand affair. "Evangeline, darling, it's time. Your father is waiting to escort you." As Evangeline rose, her reflection caught her eye once more. The young woman staring back at her looked beautiful but uncertain, like a bird about to be caged. She thought of her grandmother's diary hidden in her trunk, filled with entries about a loveless marriage and dreams deferred. "Mother," she said suddenly, "was grandmother happy?" Her mother's face softened with understanding. "Your grandmother learned to find happiness in unexpected places, dear one. Sometimes the path we think we want isn't the one that leads us home." The cryptic words offered little comfort as Evangeline made her way downstairs, where her father waited in his finest morning coat. Cornelius Hartwell was a man who had built an empire through determination and shrewd business sense, but as he looked at his eldest daughter, his expression showed unusual tenderness. "You look magnificent, my dear," he said, offering his arm. "The Duke is a fortunate man indeed." As they stepped into the carriage that would take them to St. Matthew's Cathedral, Evangeline caught sight of Charlotte watching from an upstairs window, her expression unreadable. The autumn air was crisp, and the trees lining Fifth Avenue had turned brilliant shades of gold and crimson, as if nature itself was celebrating, or mourning, this union. The cathedral loomed before them, its Gothic spires reaching toward a sky that seemed unusually gray for such an important day. As they approached the massive oak doors, Evangeline could hear the organ playing inside, and she wondered if the Duke was already waiting at the altar, thinking of another bride, another time. But what troubled her most was the growing certainty that this marriage would test her in ways she had never imagined, and she wasn't sure she possessed the strength to emerge unbroken. What secrets lay hidden in the Duke's past, and would she ever be more than a pale shadow of the woman who had claimed his heart first? The interior of St. Matthew's Cathedral was a masterpiece of Gothic Revival architecture, its soaring arches and stained glass windows creating an atmosphere of sacred grandeur that befitted New York's most elite families. Every pew was filled with the cream of society: railroad barons, shipping magnates, and old Knickerbocker families whose names had shaped the city since its Dutch origins. The scent of white roses and orange blossoms filled the air, while hundreds of candles cast a warm, golden glow over the assembled guests. Evangeline's heart hammered against her ribs as she stood at the cathedral's entrance, her hand resting on her father's arm. Through the open doors she could see Duke Harrison Blackwood III waiting at the altar, tall and imposing in his black morning coat. Even from this distance she could sense the rigid control he maintained over his emotions, the way he stood like a soldier at attention rather than a bridegroom awaiting his beloved. "Remember, my dear," her father whispered as the wedding march began, "you are a Hartwell. We do not falter in the face of duty." The processional began, and Evangeline moved down the aisle with measured steps, her silk train rustling against the marble floor. She was acutely aware of every eye upon her, every whispered comment from the assembled guests. Mrs. Astor nodded approvingly from the front pew, while the Vanderbilt matriarch studied her with calculating eyes. This was more than a wedding. It was a merger of empires, witnessed by the most powerful families in America. As she drew closer to the altar, Evangeline could see the Duke's face more clearly. His features were aristocratic and handsome, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw that spoke of generations of breeding. But his blue eyes held a coldness that made her shiver despite the warmth of her heavy gown. When their gazes met, she searched for some sign of warmth, some hint of the affection that might grow between them. Instead, she saw only duty reflected back at her. Standing beside the Duke was his best man, Theodore Whitmore, a childhood friend whose easy smile provided a stark contrast to the groom's stern demeanor. Behind them, in the front pew, sat the Duke's two young daughters, 7-year-old Isabella and 5-year-old Sophia. The girls were dressed in matching blue velvet, their dark hair arranged in perfect ringlets, but their faces showed the solemn confusion of children who had lost their mother too young. The ceremony proceeded with all the pomp and circumstance befitting such a union. Reverend Dr. Morgan, whose sermons were attended by the city's most influential families, spoke of duty, honor, and the sacred bonds of matrimony. His words echoed through the cathedral, but Evangeline found herself focusing on the Duke's hands, strong and well manicured, but cold when they briefly touched hers during the exchange of rings. The diamond ring he placed on her finger was magnificent, a family heirloom that had belonged to Blackwood brides for 3 generations. Yet as it slid into place, Evangeline couldn't shake the feeling that she was being branded rather than wed. The weight of it felt foreign and heavy, a constant reminder of the role she was expected to play. "Do you, Harrison Blackwood, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do you part?" "I do." The Duke's voice was steady and clear, but devoid of emotion. He might have been reciting a business contract rather than wedding vows. When it came time for Evangeline's vows, her voice trembled slightly, betraying the nervousness she had tried so hard to conceal. "I do," she whispered, the words seeming to seal her fate. "You may kiss the bride," Reverend Dr. Morgan announced, his voice carrying throughout the cathedral. This was the moment Evangeline had both anticipated and dreaded. As the Duke leaned toward her, She closed her eyes and tried to imagine that this kiss would mark the beginning of something beautiful, something that might grow into love despite its practical origins. His lips touched hers, cool, controlled, and utterly passionless. It was a kiss of duty, nothing more. But as he pulled away, his mouth close to her ear, he whispered words that would haunt her forever. "My heart died with the mother of my daughters. Do not expect what I cannot give." The words hit her like a physical blow. Evangeline's eyes flew open, and she saw the Duke's face, not cruel, but utterly indifferent. Around them, the congregation erupted in polite applause, unaware of the devastating pronouncement that had just shattered the bride's world. Her bouquet of white roses and orange blossoms slipped from her suddenly nerveless fingers, falling to the marble floor with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the cathedral. Several guests in the front rows noticed, and she saw Mrs. Whitmore lean forward with concern. But Evangeline couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what had just happened. The Duke, seemingly oblivious to her distress, turned to face the congregation with a practiced smile. He offered his arm to escort her down the aisle, and years of training in proper deportment forced her to take it, though her legs felt like water beneath her elaborate gown. As they walked back down the aisle, Evangeline was dimly aware of the smiling faces around them, the shower of rice and rose petals, the joyful music of the organ. But all she could hear were those terrible words echoing in her mind. "My heart died with the mother of my daughters." In the third pew she caught sight of Charlotte, her sister's face showing what might have been sympathy or satisfaction. Had Charlotte known this would happen? Had she deliberately planted those seeds of doubt about the Duke's devotion to his first wife? The receiving line outside the cathedral was a blur of congratulations and well wishes. Evangeline smiled and nodded mechanically, accepting kisses on her cheek and compliments on her gown, all while feeling as though she were watching someone else's life unfold. The Duke played his part perfectly, the devoted bridegroom accepting congratulations on his good fortune. "Such a lovely bride," gushed Mrs. Belmont, one of society's most influential hostesses. "And how wonderful for little Isabella and Sophia to have a new mother." "Indeed," the Duke replied smoothly. "Evangeline will provide them with the guidance they need. Guidance, not love, not affection, guidance." As if she were being hired as a governess rather than welcomed as a stepmother. The wedding breakfast at the Hartwell mansion was an elaborate affair, with tables groaning under the weight of delicacies imported from across the globe. Crystal champagne flutes caught the light from massive chandeliers, and the finest musicians in the city provided entertainment for the distinguished guests. But Evangeline moved through it all like a ghost, smiling when expected, speaking when spoken to, but feeling utterly disconnected from the celebration of her own marriage. During the toasts, Theodore Whitmore spoke eloquently about friendship and new beginnings, while her father praised the union of two great families. But when the Duke rose to speak, his words were brief and formal, thanking the guests for their presence and expressing his appreciation for the Hartwell family's generous gift of their daughter. A gift. That's all she was. A commodity to be transferred from one household to another. As the afternoon wore on, Evangeline found herself watching the Duke's daughters, who sat quietly at a small table decorated with flowers and ribbons. They were beautiful children, with their father's dark hair and what she imagined were their mother's delicate features. But they regarded her with the polite wariness of children who had learned not to trust too easily. When it came time for the bride and groom to depart for their wedding trip to Newport, Evangeline felt a moment of panic. She would be alone with this man who had just made it clear that she would never hold his heart, traveling to a place where she would have to pretend to be a happy bride while knowing the truth of her situation. As their carriage pulled away from the mansion, the Duke settled back against the leather seats and opened a newspaper, effectively dismissing her presence. Evangeline stared out the window at the familiar streets of Manhattan, wondering if she would ever feel at home anywhere again. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the clip-clop of horses' hooves and the rustle of newspaper pages. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, Evangeline spoke. "Your Grace, about what you said at the altar." "I spoke the truth," he interrupted without looking up from his paper. "I thought it best to establish expectations from the beginning. You will be mistress of my household and mother to my children. That should be sufficient." Sufficient. The word echoed in her mind as the carriage carried them toward their new life together. But what Evangeline didn't yet realize was that this devastating beginning would force her to discover reserves of strength she never knew she possessed, and that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the most broken hearts. The Newport mansion that served as the Blackwood family's summer retreat stood like a monument to American wealth and ambition, its sprawling grounds overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, built in the style of an Italian palazzo, with marble columns and terraced gardens. It should have been a romantic setting for a honeymoon. Instead, for Evangeline, It felt like an elegant prison where she was expected to play the role of contented bride while her heart remained in pieces. The Duke had maintained his cold politeness throughout their 3-day journey, treating her with the same distant courtesy he might show a business associate. Their conversations were limited to practical matters, the running of his households, the care of his daughters, and the social obligations that would be expected of her as the new Duchess. At night he retired to his own chambers, leaving Evangeline alone in the opulent master suite that had once belonged to his first wife. Everything in the room spoke of Isabella's presence, the Spanish lace curtains, the delicate porcelain figurines, even the faint scent of jasmine that seemed to linger in the very walls. Evangeline felt like an intruder in a shrine, constantly reminded that she was merely a replacement for a woman who had been truly loved. On the 4th morning of their stay, Evangeline received an unexpected visitor. She was sitting in the morning room attempting to read while the Duke attended to business correspondence when the butler announced the arrival of Mrs. Agatha Pemberton. Evangeline's heart leaped with relief. Agatha was her father's sister, a woman who had scandalized society by refusing to marry and instead dedicating her life to charitable work and intellectual pursuits. "My dear child," Aunt Agatha said as she swept into the room, her traveling dress practical rather than fashionable, her silver hair pinned back in a simple chignon. At 55, she possessed a vitality and independence that made her seem younger than her years. "I hope you don't mind my unexpected arrival, but I simply had to see how you were settling into married life." Evangeline rose to embrace her aunt, fighting back tears at the sight of a friendly face. "Aunt Agatha, what a wonderful surprise. But how did you know where to find me?" "Your mother mentioned your honeymoon destination," Agatha replied, her sharp gray eyes studying Evangeline's face with concern. "Though I must say you look rather pale for a new bride. Are you quite well?" Before Evangeline could answer, the Duke appeared in the doorway. "Mrs. Pemberton," he said with a polite bow. "What an unexpected pleasure." "Your Grace," Agatha replied with equal formality, though Evangeline detected a note of coolness in her aunt's voice. "I hope you don't mind my intrusion, but I was traveling through Newport and couldn't resist calling on my niece." "Of course not. Please join us for luncheon." The Duke's invitation was perfectly proper, but Evangeline sensed his reluctance. "I'm afraid I have some urgent business matters to attend to, but I'm sure Evangeline would enjoy your company." After he left, Agatha settled herself in a chair near the window, her gaze never leaving Evangeline's face. "Now then, my dear, tell me truthfully, how are you really?" The simple question, asked with such genuine concern, broke through Evangeline's carefully maintained composure. Tears she had been holding back for days finally spilled over, and she found herself pouring out the whole miserable story, the Duke's cruel words at the altar, his continued coldness, and her growing certainty that she would never be anything more than a convenient arrangement. Agatha listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making soft sounds of sympathy. When Evangeline finished, her aunt was quiet for a long moment, gazing out at the ocean where white-capped waves crashed against the rocky shore. "My dear girl," Agatha finally said, "I'm going to tell you something that may sound harsh, but it comes from a place of love. You are allowing yourself to be diminished by a man who is too wounded to see your worth. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" "What can I do?" Evangeline asked helplessly. "I'm married to him. This is my life now." "Nonsense," Agatha said briskly. "Marriage is not a death sentence, though some people treat it as such. You have intelligence, spirit, and resources. The question is whether you're willing to use them." Over the next 2 days, while the Duke remained absorbed in his business affairs, Agatha opened Evangeline's eyes to possibilities she had never considered. Her aunt spoke of women who had carved out meaningful lives despite difficult circumstances, women who had started schools, founded hospitals, written books, and fought for social reform. In Boston, Agatha said as they walked through the mansion's elaborate gardens, "I know a remarkable woman named Dr. Sarah McKinley. She's one of the first female physicians in the country, and she's established a clinic that serves the city's poorest neighborhoods. She's looking for educated women to help with her work, not just as volunteers, but as partners in creating real change." Evangeline felt a spark of interest, the first genuine emotion she had experienced since her wedding day. "A female doctor? I've never heard of such a thing. The world is changing, my dear, faster than most people realize. Women are attending universities, entering professions, making their voices heard. Why should you limit yourself to being merely decorative when you could be useful?" That evening, as they sat in the library after dinner, Agatha shared stories of her own work with immigrant families in New York's tenements. She spoke passionately about the need for education, health care, and basic human dignity for all people, regardless of their station in life. "I've never married," Agatha said, "not because I'm opposed to the institution, but because I've never met a man who could accept that I have a purpose beyond making him comfortable. You, however, are already married. The question is whether you'll allow that marriage to define the limits of your existence, The Duke joined them briefly, making polite conversation about the weather and local society before excusing himself to write letters. After he left, Agatha shook her head sadly. "That man is drowning in his own grief," she observed. "He's built walls so high around his heart that he can't see the life that's trying to bloom right in front of him. But you, my dear, don't have to drown with him." On Agatha's final morning at Newport, she made an unexpected proposal. "Come to Boston with me," she said as they sat on the terrace overlooking the ocean. "Not permanently, of course, but for a visit. Meet Dr. McKinley, see the work we're doing, and discover what you might be capable of. Your husband can hardly object to your visiting family." Evangeline felt her heart race with a mixture of excitement and fear. "But what about my duties here? The children, the household will survive perfectly well without you for a few weeks," Agatha said firmly. "My dear girl, you've been married less than a week, and already you're talking like a woman who's forgotten she has a mind of her own. That's not the niece I raised to think for herself." That afternoon, as Agatha prepared to depart, Evangeline made a decision that surprised even herself. She approached the Duke in his study, where he sat surrounded by ledgers and correspondence, looking every inch the successful businessman. "Your Grace," she began, her voice steadier than she felt, "I would like to accept my aunt's invitation to visit her in Boston." He looked up from his papers, his blue eyes showing mild surprise. "When? Next month, perhaps, after we return to New York and I've had time to settle into the household routine." The Duke studied her for a moment, and Evangeline wondered if he could see the change that was already beginning to take root in her. Heart a growing determination to find purpose and meaning beyond the narrow confines of her arranged marriage. "Very well," he said finally. "I see no objection to a brief visit with family. It will give you an opportunity to see something of the world beyond New York society." As Evangeline left his study, she felt something she hadn't experienced since her wedding day. Hope. Not for her marriage, perhaps, but for herself. Aunt Agatha had shown her that there were other ways to live, other purposes to pursue, and other definitions of fulfillment beyond being a dutiful wife to a man who would never love her. But what she didn't yet realize was that this journey of self-discovery would lead her not only to a new understanding of her own capabilities, but to an encounter that would challenge everything she thought she knew about love, duty, and the courage required to choose one's own destiny. In Boston, among the reformers and intellectuals who gathered around Dr. McKinley's clinic, she would meet someone who would see her not as a replacement for a dead woman, but as a remarkable individual worthy of respect and affection. The question was, would she have the courage to embrace the life that awaited her, even if it meant defying the expectations of everyone she had ever known? 3 months had passed since Evangeline's transformative visit to Boston, and the woman who returned to the Blackwood mansion on Fifth Avenue was markedly different from the broken bride who had left. Her time at Dr. Sarah McKinley's clinic had awakened something within her, a sense of purpose and capability that no amount of finishing school education had ever provided. She had assisted with medical procedures, taught reading to immigrant children, and organized fundraising efforts that had raised substantial sums for the clinic's expansion. More importantly, she had met Dr. Elias Reed, a young physician from Philadelphia who had come to Boston to study Dr. McKinley's innovative approaches to public health. Elias was everything the Duke was not: warm, intellectually curious, and genuinely interested in Evangeline's thoughts and opinions. Their friendship had developed naturally over shared work and long conversations about social reform, literature, and the changing role of women in American society. Now, as Evangeline prepared for the autumn season's most prestigious social event, Mrs. Astor's annual charity gala for the Metropolitan Opera, she felt a confidence she had never possessed before. Her new gown, a creation of deep emerald silk that complemented her auburn hair and green eyes, had been chosen not to please her husband, but to reflect her own sense of style and dignity. "You look radiant, Your Grace," said her new lady's maid, Helen, a young woman she had hired upon her return from Boston. Unlike the previous maid, who had been chosen by the Duke's housekeeper, Helen was intelligent and well-read, someone who could serve as both assistant and companion. "Thank you, Helen," Evangeline replied, fastening her grandmother's emerald necklace, a piece she had reclaimed from the family vault, preferring it to the cold diamonds the Duke had given her. "Have you heard whether Dr. Reed has arrived in the city?" "Yes, Your Grace. I believe he's staying at the Fifth Avenue Hotel and plans to attend tonight's gala." Dr. McKinley wrote to confirm his presence. Evangeline felt her heart quicken at the news. Elias had written to inform her of his visit to New York, ostensibly to consult with physicians at Bellevue Hospital about establishing similar clinics in Philadelphia. But his letters had carried an undertone of personal interest that both thrilled and terrified her. The Duke appeared in the doorway of her dressing room, resplendent in white tie and tails. Over the months since their marriage, their relationship had settled into a pattern of polite coexistence. He fulfilled his duties as husband in the most minimal sense, escorting her to social functions, providing for her material needs, and treating her with distant courtesy. In return, she managed his household efficiently and served as a proper stepmother to his daughters, though the children remained reserved and watchful in her presence. "Are you ready?" he asked, his tone suggesting mild impatience. "Quite ready," Evangeline replied, accepting the velvet cloak Helen offered her. The carriage ride to the Astor mansion was conducted in their usual silence, but Evangeline found herself less troubled by it than before. Her time in Boston had taught her that silence could be peaceful rather than oppressive, and she had learned to find contentment in her own thoughts rather than seeking validation from her emotionally unavailable husband. The Astor Ballroom was a glittering spectacle of New York's elite, with crystal chandeliers casting rainbow prisms across the assembled guests. The cream of society had turned out for the evening. Vanderbilt's Whitneys, and Belmonts mingling with foreign dignitaries and cultural luminaries. Mrs. Astor herself, the undisputed queen of New York society, held court near the grand staircase, her diamond tiara catching the light as she greeted her guests. Evangeline moved through the receiving line with practiced grace, accepting compliments on her appearance and making appropriate conversation about the evening's charitable cause. But her eyes searched the crowd for a familiar face, and when she finally spotted Elias near the refreshment table, her heart leaped with genuine joy. Dr. Elias Reed was not conventionally handsome in the way that society valued. He lacked the Duke's aristocratic features and commanding presence, but his face was intelligent and kind, with warm brown eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and sandy hair that never quite stayed in place despite his best efforts. When he smiled, which he did often, his entire face lit up with genuine warmth. "Dr. Reed," Evangeline said as she approached, extending her gloved hand. "What a pleasant surprise to see you in New York." "Your Grace," he replied, bowing over her hand with a respect that felt entirely different from the perfunctory courtesy she was accustomed to. "You look absolutely radiant. Boston has clearly agreed with you." Before she could respond, she felt a presence at her elbow and turned to find Charlotte, resplendent in pink silk and diamonds, her smile as bright and sharp as a blade. "Sister dear," Charlotte said, her voice carrying just far enough to attract attention from nearby guests. "How lovely to see you looking so animated. And who is this charming gentleman?" Evangeline performed the introductions with careful propriety, noting how Charlotte's eyes assessed Elias with the calculating gaze of a woman who instinctively recognized a threat to the established order. "A doctor," Charlotte mused, her tone suggesting she found the profession quaint. "How fascinating. And you work with the poor, I understand. How very noble of you." Elias smiled politely, seemingly unaware of the subtle condescension in Charlotte's voice. "I find the work deeply rewarding, Miss Hartwell. There's something profoundly satisfying about using one's skills to help those who need it most." "Indeed," Charlotte replied, "though I imagine it must be quite different from the sort of medicine practiced among our own circle. So much more challenging." Evangeline felt her temper flare at her sister's obvious attempt to diminish Elias, but before she could respond, the Duke appeared at her side. His arrival created a subtle shift in the group's dynamic, as other guests turned to acknowledge his presence. "Your Grace," Elias said, extending his hand to the Duke. "I'm Dr. Elias Reed. I had the pleasure of meeting your wife during her visit to Boston." The Duke shook hands with polite formality, but Evangeline noticed the way his blue eyes assessed the younger man with cool calculation. "Dr. Reed, I trust you found my wife's assistance valuable to your work." "Invaluable," Elias replied warmly, his gaze moving to Evangeline with obvious admiration. "Her Grace has a remarkable mind and a genuine compassion for those less fortunate. Dr. McKinley speaks of her in the highest terms." Something flickered in the Duke's eyes, surprise perhaps, or annoyance that his wife had made such an impression on strangers. Indeed, Evangeline has always been dutiful in her charitable endeavors. The word dutiful hung in the air like a dismissal, reducing Evangeline's passionate work to mere social obligation. She felt her cheeks flush with indignation, but Elias stepped smoothly into the breach. "Oh, I think dutiful hardly captures it," he said with a gentle smile. "What I witnessed was genuine dedication and remarkable capability. Her Grace organized a fundraising effort that raised more money in 2 weeks than we typically see in 6 months. She has a gift for inspiring others to action." The compliment was delivered with such sincerity that even Charlotte seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Evangeline felt a warmth spread through her chest, not just from the praise, but from being truly seen and valued for her contributions. "How wonderful," the Duke said, his tone suggesting the conversation had gone on quite long enough. "If you'll excuse us, Dr. Reed, I believe they're about to announce dinner," as they moved toward the dining room. Evangeline caught Elias's eye and saw understanding there. He had recognized the subtle dynamics at play, and had deliberately chosen to champion her worth in front of her husband and sister. The gesture was both gallant and dangerous. marking him as someone who saw her as more than just the Duke's convenient wife. Dinner was an elaborate affair with 12 courses and entertainment between each, but Evangeline found herself distracted by thoughts of her conversation with Elias. Across the table, she noticed Charlotte whispering to Mrs. Whitmore, their gazes occasionally flicking in her direction. Whatever her sister was saying, it was clearly not flattering. After dinner, as the guests moved to the ballroom for dancing, Evangeline found herself approached by Mrs. Belmont, one of society's most influential hostesses. "My dear Duchess," Mrs. Belmont said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard, "I understand you've been doing remarkable work in Boston. I'm organizing a committee to establish a similar clinic here in New York, and I would very much like your involvement." The invitation was both an honor and a challenge. Mrs. Belmont's committees were known for their effectiveness and their demanding standards. Before Evangeline could respond, she felt the Duke's hand on her arm. "How generous of you, Mrs. Belmont," he said smoothly. "However, I'm afraid Evangeline's duties at home must take precedence. Perhaps when the children are older." The dismissal was polite but firm, and Evangeline felt something inside her rebel against being spoken for so casually. "Actually," she said, her voice carrying a new note of authority, "I would be very interested in discussing the project further, Mrs. Belmont. Perhaps we could arrange a meeting next week." The Duke's hand tightened slightly on her arm, but his expression remained pleasant. "Of course, my dear, though I hope you won't overextend yourself." As Mrs. Belmont moved away, clearly pleased with Evangeline's response, the Duke leaned closer to his wife. "I think we should discuss your enthusiasms privately," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. But Evangeline was no longer the frightened bride who had trembled at his displeasure. "By all means," she replied calmly. "I have quite a lot to say on the subject." The evening's final surprise came as the guests were beginning to depart. Elias approached her once more, this time with a formal invitation that would change everything. "Your Grace," he said, "I'm hosting a small gathering tomorrow evening, a discussion group focused on social reform and public health initiatives. Dr. McKinley will be joining us by telephone from Boston, and several prominent New Yorkers have expressed interest. I would be honored if you would attend." The invitation was perfectly proper. Intellectual gathering with respectable attendees. But Evangeline knew it represented something more, a choice between the narrow confines of her current life and the broader world of purpose and possibility that awaited her. "I would be delighted to attend," she said, ignoring the Duke's sharp intake of breath beside her. As they rode home in tense silence, Evangeline realized that the evening had marked a turning point. She was no longer content to be merely the Duke's convenient wife, and she was no longer afraid of his disapproval. And the question now was whether she had the courage to fully embrace the woman she was becoming, even if it meant defying every expectation that had been placed upon her. What she didn't yet know was that her decision to attend Elias's gathering would set in motion a series of events that would force her to choose between the security of her current life and the uncertain promise of something far more meaningful, and that the Duke's reaction would reveal depths of his character she had never suspected. Okay. The confrontation Evangeline had anticipated came the morning after Mrs. Astor's gala, but not in the manner she had expected. Instead of the cold anger she had grown accustomed to, the Duke appeared in her private sitting room with an expression of genuine bewilderment, as if he were seeing her clearly for the first time since their wedding. "Evangeline," he began, settling into the chair across from her writing desk where she had been composing letters, "I believe we need to discuss what occurred last evening." She set down her pen and regarded him with the calm composure she had cultivated during her months of self-discovery. "I agree completely. Which aspect would you like to address first? My acceptance of Mrs. Belmont's invitation, or my plan to attend Dr. Reed's gathering this evening?" The Duke's eyebrows rose slightly at her directness. In the early months of their marriage, she would have waited anxiously for him to voice his displeasure, then apologize profusely for any perceived transgression. This new version of his wife clearly intended to meet him as an equal. "Both, I suppose," he said carefully. "I'm concerned that you may be overreaching in your enthusiasm for these charitable pursuits." "Overreaching?" Evangeline repeated, her voice carrying a note of steel that made him shift uncomfortably. "I'm curious about your definition of that term. You mean that I'm exceeding the proper bounds of feminine behavior, or that I'm acting beyond my intellectual capabilities?" The question hung in the air between them, and for a moment the Duke seemed genuinely at a loss for words. He had married a quiet, compliant young woman who had accepted his emotional distance without complaint. The woman sitting before him now possessed a confidence and self-assurance that was both attractive and unsettling. "I mean," he said finally, "that you have responsibilities here that should take precedence over outside interests, such as the children, for one. Isabella and Sophia need stability and guidance." Evangeline leaned back in her chair, studying her husband's face with new eyes. "The children spend their mornings with their governess, their afternoons with their tutors, and their evenings in the nursery with their nanny. They see me for perhaps an hour each day, during which time I read to them or help with their lessons. Hardly a demanding schedule that would prevent me from pursuing meaningful work. There are also social obligations which I have fulfilled without fail, Evangeline interrupted smoothly. I have attended every function you've deemed necessary, hosted the dinner parties you've requested, and maintained your household to the standards expected of our position. What I'm proposing is to add substance to a life that has been largely ornamental. The Duke rose and moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he gazed out at the bustling street below. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of something that might have been vulnerability. I married you because I needed a wife who would not complicate my life with emotional demands. Someone who would understand that I had nothing left to give beyond the practical requirements of marriage. And I have understood that, Evangeline replied quietly. I have never asked for your love or even your affection. But neither did I agree to become a decorative object with no purpose beyond reflecting credit on your name. He turned to face her, and she was surprised to see something like respect in his blue eyes. You've changed, he observed. Yes, I have. The question is whether you can accept the woman I'm becoming, or whether you'll insist on trying to preserve the frightened girl you married. Before he could respond, there was a soft knock at the door, and Helen entered with a calling card on a silver tray. Begging your pardon, Your Grace, but Miss Charlotte Hartwell is here to see you, and she says it's quite urgent. Evangeline felt a familiar sense of foreboding at her sister's unexpected visit. Please show her in, Helen. Charlotte swept into the room in a rustle of silk and barely contained excitement. Her cheeks flushed with what appeared to be righteous indignation. She curtsied briefly to the Duke before turning to her sister, with an expression of theatrical concern. Evangeline, darling, I simply had to come at once. The most dreadful rumors are circulating about last evening, and I felt you should be warned. What sort of rumors? The Duke asked, his voice sharp with sudden attention. Charlotte's eyes gleamed with malicious satisfaction as she delivered her carefully prepared blow. Well, it seems that Dr. Reed has been quite vocal about his admiration for Evangeline. Several people overheard him telling Mrs. S. Whitmore that he found her remarkably intelligent and utterly wasted in her current circumstances. Can you imagine such presumption? Evangeline felt her cheeks burn, not with shame but with anger at her sister's obvious manipulation. And you felt compelled to repeat this gossip because ... Because I'm concerned for your reputation, of course, Charlotte replied with false sweetness. People are beginning to talk about your friendship with this doctor. Mrs. Vanderbilt mentioned that you seemed quite animated in his company, and you know how quickly these things can spiral out of control. The Duke's expression had grown thunderous during Charlotte's recitation, and Evangeline could see the possessive anger building in his eyes. Not the anger of a man whose heart was threatened, but the fury of someone whose property had been publicly criticized. I see, he said coldly. And what exactly did Dr. Reed mean by wasted in her current circumstances? Oh, I couldn't possibly repeat everything, Charlotte said with feigned reluctance. But there was some mention of Evangeline's extraordinary capabilities being constrained by conventional expectations. Really, the man seems to have quite radical ideas about women's roles in society. Evangeline rose from her chair, her composure finally cracking under the weight of her sister's calculated cruelty. Enough, she said, her voice cutting through Charlotte's performance like a blade. I will not sit here and listen to you twist an honest conversation into something sordid for your own entertainment, Evangeline. Charlotte gasped, pressing a hand to her chest in mock horror. I'm only trying to protect you from scandal. No, Evangeline replied firmly. You're trying to create one. The question is why. For a moment Charlotte's mask slipped, revealing the jealousy and resentment that had always lurked beneath her sweet exterior. Perhaps because I'm tired of watching you play the martyr while receiving praise for work that any well-bred woman could accomplish. You're not special, Evangeline. You're simply married to a man wealthy enough to indulge your pretensions. The words hung in the air like a slap, and Evangeline felt something crystallize inside her, a final understanding of the dynamics that had shaped her entire life. Charlotte had always resented her elder sister's intelligence and independence, and now she was using Evangeline's marriage as a weapon to diminish her further. You're right about one thing, Evangeline said quietly. I am married to a wealthy man, but that wealth doesn't define my worth any more than your beauty defines yours. The difference between us is that I've learned to find value in myself beyond what others think of me. The Duke had been watching this exchange with growing fascination, as if seeing both women clearly for the first time. When he spoke, his voice carried a new note of authority. Charlotte, he said firmly, I think this conversation has gone quite far enough. I appreciate your concern for my wife's reputation, but I'm perfectly capable of managing my own household affairs. Charlotte's face flushed with embarrassment at the dismissal, but she managed a stiff curtsy. Of course, Your Grace, I simply thought you should be aware of what people are saying. After Charlotte left, the Duke and Evangeline stood in silence for several long moments. Finally he spoke, his voice thoughtful rather than angry. "She's jealous of you," he observed. "Yes," Evangeline agreed. "Always has been. And Dr. Reed, what are his intentions toward you?" Evangeline met her husband's gaze steadily. "He respects my intelligence and values my contributions to meaningful work. Beyond that, his intentions are entirely honorable. But you care for him. It wasn't a question." And Evangeline saw no point in denying what was probably obvious to anyone who had observed them together. "I care for him as a friend and colleague. He has shown me possibilities I never knew existed." The Duke nodded slowly, as if processing this information. "And what do you intend to do about these possibilities?" "I intend to attend his gathering this evening as planned. I intend to accept Mrs. Belmont's invitation to join her committee, and I intend to continue pursuing work that gives my life meaning and purpose, even if it causes scandal." "Even if it causes scandal," Evangeline confirmed. "I will not live my life in fear of what Charlotte or anyone else might say." To her surprise, the Duke smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him since their wedding day. "You know," he said quietly, "Isabella would have liked you very much. She had the same fierce independence, the same refusal to be diminished by others' expectations." It was the first time he had spoken of his first wife as anything other than a perfect memory, and Evangeline felt something shift between them. Not love, perhaps, but a new understanding and respect. "Thank you," she said simply. "Go to your gathering tonight," he said, moving toward the door. "But Evangeline, be careful. Not everyone will appreciate the woman you're becoming that evening." As Evangeline prepared for Dr. Reed's gathering, she felt a sense of anticipation unlike anything she had experienced since her wedding day. She chose a simple but elegant dress of deep blue wool, appropriate for an intellectual discussion rather than a social event. As Helen arranged her hair in a modest chignon, Evangeline caught sight of herself in the mirror and was surprised by what she saw, a woman who looked confident, purposeful, and genuinely happy. The gathering was held in the parlor of a modest but comfortable townhouse on East 23rd Street, far from the opulent mansions of Fifth Avenue. When Evangeline arrived, she found herself in the company of a dozen individuals who represented a cross-section of New York's progressive thinkers, doctors, teachers, social workers, and reform-minded citizens who shared a common commitment to improving society. Dr. Reed greeted her warmly, introducing her to the other attendees with obvious pride in her accomplishments. As the evening progressed, Evangeline found herself engaged in the most stimulating conversations of her life, discussing everything from public health initiatives to women's education to the growing labor movement. When the telephone connection to Dr. McKinley in Boston was established, Evangeline felt a thrill of excitement at being part of such an innovative communication. The discussion that followed was both practical and visionary, focusing on concrete steps that could be taken to address the pressing social issues of their time. As the evening drew to a close, Dr. Reed approached her with a proposal that would change everything. "Evangeline," he said, using her given name for the first time, "I've been offered a position establishing a new clinic in Chicago, a comprehensive facility that would serve as a model for urban healthcare reform. The position would require someone with administrative skills, fundraising experience, and a genuine commitment to the work. I can think of no one better qualified than you." The offer hung between them, representing everything she had discovered she wanted from life purpose, respect, and the opportunity to make a real difference in the world. But it also represented a choice that would require her to leave behind everything she had ever known. I would need time to consider such a proposition," she said carefully. "Of course," Elias replied. "But Evangeline, I want you to know that this offer comes not just from professional respect, but from personal admiration. You are an extraordinary woman, and you deserve a life that recognizes and celebrates that fact." As her carriage carried her home through the gaslit streets of Manhattan, Evangeline realized that she stood at a crossroads that would define the rest of her life. She could remain in her comfortable but constrained existence as the Duke's convenient wife, or she could choose the uncertain but promising path that Elias had offered. What she didn't yet know was that her decision would not only transform her own life, but would also force the Duke to confront truths about himself and his marriage that he had been avoiding since their wedding day. The question was whether either of them had the courage to embrace the changes that lay ahead. 6 months had passed since Evangeline made the decision that shocked New York society and transformed her life forever. Standing on the platform of Chicago's Union Station on a crisp spring morning in 1896, she watched as another train arrived carrying supplies for the McKinley Reed Clinic, the comprehensive healthcare facility that had become her life's work. The woman who had once been the Duke's convenient wife was now Dr. Elias Reed's partner in both professional endeavors and in life, though their marriage had been a quiet affair witnessed only by Dr. McKinley and a handful of close friends. The journey to this moment had been neither simple nor without sacrifice. The legal dissolution of her marriage to the Duke had required months of delicate negotiations, complicated by the social scandal that erupted when news of her departure became public. New York society had been divided between those who whispered of her shameful abandonment of duty and those who quietly admired her courage to seek happiness on her own terms. The newspapers had been merciless for weeks, with headlines proclaiming everything from the runaway duchess to a modern woman's folly, but Evangeline had weathered the storm. With a strength she never knew she possessed, supported by Aunt Agatha's unwavering encouragement and Elias's steadfast devotion, the Duke, to his credit, had eventually agreed to the divorce without contest, perhaps recognizing that their marriage had been doomed from its very beginning. His final letter to her had been surprisingly gracious. "I hope you find the happiness that has eluded us both. You deserve a man who can see your worth, something I was too blinded by grief to accomplish." The clinic occupied a renovated warehouse in Chicago's rapidly growing West Side, its red brick facade now bearing a simple but elegant sign: McKinley Reed Community Health Center. The building served the city's diverse population of immigrants, factory workers, and their families. But it had grown far beyond Elias's original vision under Evangeline's transformative leadership. What had begun as a modest medical practice had flourished into a comprehensive facility that included not only medical care but also educational programs, child care services, job training initiatives, and advocacy programs that were beginning to influence city policy. Mrs. Reed called Margaret O'Sullivan, the clinic's head nurse, as she approached with a clipboard full of the day's appointments. Margaret was a sturdy Irish woman in her 40s who had initially been skeptical of the young society woman who had arrived from New York with grand ideas about healthcare reform. Now she was one of Evangeline's most devoted supporters, having witnessed firsthand how the former Duchess had rolled up her sleeves and worked alongside the staff in every capacity, from scrubbing floors to lobbying city officials. "The delegation from the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania has arrived for their tour," Margaret continued, her voice carrying a note of pride. "They're particularly interested in our maternal health program, and Dr. Harrison from Philadelphia specifically requested to meet with you about replicating our model in their city." Evangeline smiled, still feeling a small thrill at hearing her chosen name. The transformation from Duchess Blackwood to Mrs. Reed had been more than a simple change of title. It represented a complete reimagining of her identity and purpose. The elaborate gowns and jewels had been replaced by practical wool dresses and simple gold jewelry. The grand mansion on Fifth Avenue had given way to a modest but comfortable home near the clinic. Most importantly, the empty days filled with social obligations had been replaced by meaningful work that challenged her intellect and fulfilled her soul. "Excellent," Evangeline replied, adjusting the simple gold band on her fingers so different from the elaborate diamond that had once symbolized her captivity. "Please show them to the conference room. I'll join them shortly, but first I want to check on Mrs. Kowalski and her new baby." As she made her way through the clinic's bustling corridors, Evangeline marveled at how completely her life had changed. The frightened bride who had once trembled at her husband's displeasure had become a confident woman who regularly addressed medical conferences, lobbied city officials for funding, and managed a staff of 30 dedicated professionals. The walls of the clinic were lined with photographs documenting their work images of healthy babies born to mothers who might otherwise have died in childbirth, children learning to read in their educational programs, and families who had found hope and healing within these walls. The maternal health program that had drawn the delegation's attention was particularly close to her heart. Working with Dr. Sarah McKinley, who visited from Boston quarterly, they had developed innovative approaches to prenatal care that had dramatically reduced infant mortality rates in their district. The program included not only medical care but also education for new mothers, support groups for women facing difficult circumstances, and advocacy for better working conditions for pregnant women in the city's factories. Mrs. Anna Kowalski, a young Polish immigrant, had given birth 3 days earlier to a healthy son after receiving care throughout her pregnancy. When Evangeline entered the recovery room, she found Anna nursing her baby while her husband Stefan sat beside the bed, his weathered face glowing with joy and gratitude. "Mrs. Reed," Anna said in heavily accented English, her eyes bright with tears, "you saved my baby, you saved me. In old country, women like me, we die. Here, you make miracle." Evangeline felt the familiar tightness in her throat that came whenever she was reminded of the real impact of their work. "You're strong, Anna. You did the hard work of bringing this beautiful boy into the world. We just made sure you had the support you needed." "No," Stefan interjected, rising to shake her hand with both of his. "You give us hope when we have nothing. You treat us like family, not like strangers who don't belong." As Evangeline left the Kowalski family to their joy, she reflected on how different this interaction was from the formal charity work she had performed as a duchess. Then she had written checks and attended fundraising galas, maintaining a careful distance from the people she was supposedly helping. Now she knew her patients by name, understood their struggles intimately, and worked alongside them to create lasting change in their communities. "Evangeline," Elias called from the doorway of his office, his face lighting up with the warm smile that never failed to make her heart skip. Even after 6 months of marriage, she sometimes couldn't believe her good fortune in finding a man who valued her mind as much as her heart. His sandy hair was slightly disheveled from a long morning of surgeries, and his wire-rimmed spectacles were perched precariously on his nose. But to her, he was the most handsome man in the world. "The mayor's office just telephoned," he continued, moving to embrace her despite the busy corridor around them. "They want to discuss expanding our model to 3 additional neighborhoods, apparently. Our infant mortality statistics have caught the attention of the city health department. That's wonderful news," she replied, leaning into his embrace for a moment before the demands of the day pulled them apart again. "Though we'll need to secure additional funding before we can commit to such expansion. I've been corresponding with several wealthy families in Boston and Philadelphia who might be interested in supporting our work. Already thinking like the practical administrator," he teased, his brown eyes twinkling with affection. "This is why we make such an excellent team. You dream as big as I do, but you also know how to make those dreams reality." Their partnership was indeed remarkable, built on mutual respect, shared values, and a love that had grown naturally from friendship and common purpose. Unlike her first marriage, which had been a business arrangement disguised as romance, her relationship with Elias was founded on genuine affection and intellectual compatibility. They worked side by side during the day, discussing cases and planning programs, then spent their evenings reading together, attending lectures, or hosting gatherings of Chicago's progressive thinkers. A knock at the door interrupted their moment, and Margaret appeared with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Mrs. Reed, you have a visitor. A rather distinguished gentleman from New York who says he has urgent business to discuss. He's waiting in your office, and I must say he seems quite nervous." Evangeline felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. Despite the legal finality of her divorce and the geographical distance she had put between herself and her former life, she sometimes worried that her past might intrude upon her carefully constructed new existence. The social scandal of her departure from New York had eventually died down, but she knew there were still those who viewed her choices with disapproval or curiosity. "Did he give his name?" she asked, unconsciously straightening her simple blue dress. "Mr. Theodore Whitmore," Margaret replied. "He says he was a friend of your former husband. Quite a handsome gentleman, if you don't mind my saying so, though he looks like he's carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders." Evangeline exchanged a glance with Elias, who squeezed her hand reassuringly. Theodore had been the Duke's best man and closest friend, a kind man who had always treated her with genuine warmth during her brief time as a duchess. His presence here could mean any number of things, none of which she could predict. "Please show him to my office," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "and ask Dr. Patterson to handle the delegation tour. I'll join them as soon as possible." "Would you like me to come with you?" Elias asked quietly, his concern evident in his voice. Evangeline considered the offer, then shook her head. "I think this is something I need to face alone. But thank you for offering." Theodore Whitmore looked older than she remembered, his dark hair now showing silver at the temples and his face bearing the lines of a man who had weathered significant changes. But his smile was as warm as ever when he rose to greet her, and she was struck by how different this reunion felt from the formal interactions of her previous life. "Evangeline," he said, taking her hands in his with genuine affection, "you look absolutely radiant. Marriage clearly agrees with you this time. And this place," he gestured around the simple but efficient office. "It's remarkable what you've built here, Theodore." "What a surprise," she replied, gesturing for him to sit in one of the comfortable chairs she had arranged for consultations with patients and their families. "What brings you to Chicago? I hope nothing is wrong." His expression grew serious, and he seemed to struggle with how to begin. "I'm afraid I come bearing news that may distress you, though I hope it will also provide some closure. Harrison is remarrying." Evangeline felt a complex mix of emotions wash over her: surprise, curiosity, and something that might have been relief. The news wasn't entirely unexpected. The Duke was still a young man with significant responsibilities, and society would expect him to secure his lineage with a proper heir. Still, hearing it confirmed brought back memories of their brief, troubled union. "I see," she said carefully. "May I ask to whom?" "Miss Victoria Ashford, the daughter of the British consul," Theodore replied, watching her face closely for any sign of distress. "She's 19, quite lovely in a conventional way, and seems perfectly content to be exactly what Harrison thinks he needs in a wife. Very traditional, very compliant, very different from you." Evangeline found herself genuinely curious about this young woman who would take her place as the Duchess of Blackwood. Is she happy? Does he ... Does he care for her? Theodore considered the question carefully. I think he cares for the idea of her, if that makes sense. She represents everything he thought he wanted when he married you. A quiet, biddable wife who will manage his household, bear his children, and never challenge his assumptions about the world. Whether that will make either of them truly happy remains to be seen. I'm happy for him, Evangeline said, and was surprised to find that she meant it completely. He deserves to find peace, even if it comes in a form I could never provide. We were both trying to be people we weren't during our marriage. Theodore leaned forward in his chair, his expression intense. You truly mean that, don't you? You harbor no resentment, no regret about the path your life has taken? None whatsoever, she replied honestly, gesturing toward the window that overlooked the clinic's busy courtyard where children played while their mothers attended classes. Our marriage was a mistake from the beginning, not because either of us was a bad person, but because we were fundamentally incompatible. I needed a partner who could see me as an equal, who would encourage my ambitions rather than constrain them. He needed a wife who would be content with the role he had defined, who wouldn't challenge his carefully ordered world. He speaks of you with respect now, Theodore said quietly. It took him some time to understand what he had lost, and by then, of course, it was too late. But I think he finally recognizes that you were never the problem. The problem was his inability to move beyond his grief and see the remarkable woman standing right in front of him before Evangeline could respond. There was a gentle knock at the door, and Elias appeared with an apologetic expression. Forgive the interruption, he said, but the mayor's representative has arrived early for our meeting, and the delegation from Pennsylvania is asking specifically for you. Evangeline rose and moved to her husband's side, noting how naturally he included her in all professional discussions, how he never spoke for her or made decisions without her input. The contrast with her previous marriage was stark and illuminating. Theodore, I'd like you to meet my husband, Dr. Elias Reed, she said, her voice warm with pride. Elias, this is Mr. Theodore Whitmore, an old friend from New York. The two men shook hands, and Evangeline saw Theodore's careful assessment of Elias, the way her former brother-in-law noted the respect and affection in the younger man's eyes, the easy partnership that existed between husband and wife, the obvious intellectual equality that characterized their relationship. Dr. Reed, Theodore said, his voice carrying genuine warmth, I can see why Evangeline chose to build a new life. You're a fortunate man to have won her heart. The fortune is entirely mine, Elias replied with sincerity that made Evangeline's heart swell. Evangeline has transformed not only this clinic but my understanding of what a true partnership can be. She's taught me that love isn't about possession or control, but about supporting each other's growth and celebrating each other's achievements. After Theodore left, promising to carry word of her happiness back to New York and to give the Duke her best wishes for his future, Evangeline found herself reflecting on the strange turns her life had taken. The woman who had once been humiliated at the altar of St. Matthew's Cathedral was now a respected leader in Chicago's reform community, married to a man who cherished her intellect and supported her ambitions. The afternoon passed in a blur of productive meetings. The delegation from Pennsylvania was impressed by their innovative programs and eager to establish similar facilities in their own cities. The mayor's representative brought news of additional funding opportunities and expressed the city's interest in making Chicago a model for urban healthcare reform. By evening, Evangeline felt the deep satisfaction that came from a day spent in meaningful work. As she and Elias walked home through the tree-lined streets of their neighborhood, the setting sun casting long shadows across the sidewalks, she shared Theodore's news about the Duke's engagement. How do you feel about it? Elias asked, his arm linked through hers in the comfortable intimacy of a couple who had learned to share everything. Grateful, she replied after a moment's consideration, watching as children played in the small front gardens of their neighbors' homes. Grateful that we both found the courage to admit our mistake and seek happiness elsewhere. And grateful that I learned the difference between a marriage of convenience and a marriage of choice. And what is that difference? Elias asked, though she suspected he already knew the answer. Evangeline smiled, thinking of all the ways her life had changed since that devastating wedding day. A marriage of convenience asks you to diminish yourself to fit someone else's expectations. It's about maintaining appearances and fulfilling social obligations. A marriage of choice celebrates who you are and encourages you to become who you're meant to be. It's about growing together rather than simply coexisting. As they reached their modest but comfortable home, a two-story frame house with a wraparound porch and a garden that Evangeline had planted herself, she felt a deep sense of contentment. The house was so different from the grand mansions of Fifth Avenue, but it was truly theirs, filled with books they had chosen together, furniture that reflected their shared tastes, and memories they had created as partners. The garden she had planted was beginning to bloom, filling the evening air with the scent of roses, jasmine, and the herbs she grew for both cooking and the clinic's natural remedies program. Inside, the parlor was arranged for the weekly gathering of Chicago's progressive thinkers, a tradition she and Elias had established to continue the work of social reform and intellectual discourse. "Do you ever miss it?" Elias asked as they paused on their front steps, looking back at the city where they had built their new life together. The wealth, the status, the grand lifestyle. Evangeline looked back toward the clinic in the distance, where lights still burned in the windows as the night staff cared for patients who had nowhere else to turn. She thought of the letters she received regularly from women whose lives had been changed by their programs, the children who were learning to read in their educational initiatives, and the families who had found hope and healing within the clinic's walls. "I miss nothing about that life," she said firmly, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who had found her true calling. "I was like a beautiful bird in a golden cage, admired but never truly free to fly, to explore, to become who I was meant to be. Here I've learned not just to fly, but to soar." As they entered their home, Evangeline reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The humiliation at the altar had been devastating, but it had also been the catalyst for discovering her own strength and worth. The Duke's cruel words had shattered her illusions about romantic love, but they had also freed her to seek a life of genuine purpose and meaning. That evening, as their friends gathered for their weekly discussion, doctors and teachers, social workers and reformers, immigrants and native-born Americans united by their commitment to creating a better world, Evangeline felt a profound sense of belonging. These were her people, chosen not by accident of birth or social obligation, but by shared values and common purpose. Dr. Sarah McKinley joined them by telephone from Boston, her voice crackling through the new technology as she shared updates on the national movement for healthcare reform. Plans were discussed for a conference that would bring together progressive thinkers from across the country, with Chicago serving as the host city and the McKinley Reed Clinic as a model for what could be achieved. "Evangeline, Dr. McKinley's voice came through the telephone. "I want you to know that your work in Chicago has inspired similar efforts in 6 other cities. You've proven that a woman with vision and determination can create lasting change, regardless of her background or the obstacles she faces." Later, as she and Elias prepared for bed, Evangeline found herself thinking about Charlotte and the news Theodore had shared about her sister's recent marriage to a wealthy but elderly widower. Charlotte had chosen security and status over love or personal fulfillment, and while Evangeline felt no judgment about that choice, she also felt profound gratitude for her own different path. "Do you think she's happy?" Elias asked, having heard the story of Charlotte's calculated marriage. "I think she's content," Evangeline replied thoughtfully. "She has the life she always wanted, wealth, status, and the admiration of society. But I don't think she'll ever know the joy of being truly seen and valued for who she is, rather than what she represents." 6 months later, when she received word that the Duke's new wife had given birth to a son and heir, Evangeline felt genuine happiness for a man who had finally found the peace that had eluded him during their brief, troubled marriage. She sent a congratulatory note along with a small gift for the baby, and was touched to receive a gracious reply from the new Duchess, who seemed genuinely kind despite her youth. When news came that Charlotte had become a prominent hostess in New York society, using her husband's wealth to establish herself as a patron of the arts, Evangeline felt only mild interest. Their lives had diverged so completely that they might as well have been living in different worlds. But most of all, she felt profound gratitude for the path that had led her away from the golden cage of Fifth Avenue society and into a life where she could bloom exactly where she had chosen to plant herself. In Chicago, surrounded by the work she loved and the man who cherished her, Evangeline had discovered that true freedom came not from wealth or status, but from the courage to choose one's own destiny and the wisdom to recognize that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the most broken hearts. The woman who had once been told that her husband's heart had died with another had learned to create a life so full of purpose and joy that she needed no one else's heart to feel complete. And in that completeness, she had found a love more powerful and enduring than any she had ever imagined possible, not just romantic love, but love for her work, her community, and the woman she had become through her own choices and determination. As she drifted off to sleep in Ilias's arms, listening to the sounds of the city that had become her home, Evangeline smiled at the thought that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference, and new reasons to be grateful for the courage she had found to leave behind a life that looked perfect from the outside but felt empty within. The golden cage had been beautiful, but freedom was infinitely more precious. What an incredible journey we've witnessed, from the devastating humiliation at the altar to the triumphant discovery of true love and purpose. Evangeline's transformation from a frightened bride into a confident woman who chose her own destiny reminds us that sometimes our greatest setbacks become the foundation for our most remarkable comebacks. If this story of resilience, self-discovery, and the courage to choose love over convenience touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of triumph over adversity. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that they have the power to rewrite their own story, no matter how broken their beginning might seem. What did you think of Evangelina's journey? Have you ever had to choose between security and authenticity in your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else to find the courage to bloom where they choose to plant themselves. Remember to hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest stories of love, courage, and the extraordinary strength of the human spirit. Until next time, keep believing in the power of second chances and the beauty of choosing your own path to happiness.